So here's our board, and it has these hinge clamps on it already, so that's what we're actually going to use to lock our screens up. So before I get my screen put down, I'm going to take a couple sheets of newsprint and just put it right here on the surface of my board. Also, before you put anything down, and I already did this, but just check to make sure that there's not any big, heavy, dried ink deposits. If there are, you can use like a small razor blade scraper to scrape that up. If you have any heavily textured dried ink areas or anything that could interfere with the ink and cause some inconsistency, you want to make sure to scrape all that stuff off, remove all that, so you've got a nice smooth surface underneath. And just take your newsprint. So we use some tape to secure this to our board. Just try to get it laid out as flat as you possibly can. So I usually start with a few, just one piece in all the corners, and then I'll tape the edges down as well. So now that's taped down. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put some little mat board pieces in the corners of our screen. And the reason for that is we want to raise our screen just a little bit so that it's sitting off contact. And that's going to give the screen a little more buoyancy so that whenever we're printing, after we apply pressure, the squeegee hits the paper and kind of pops back up instead of the screen making such close contact with our paper. So that should give us a cleaner impression. So I just tape a little piece of this mat board in all four of the corners. Just one piece is enough. So one piece, all four corners. All right, so we'll flip this over now. So we're gonna have it with the well side, the inside face up, and we're gonna put that into our hinge clamps and just try to get it to where it's centered. All right, and then we'll tighten these down. I'm not gonna tighten down super tight these out in case I need to make any adjustments, but we'll tighten down. I'm going to take my stack of paper and try to have it here close by. So usually I'll have my stack of paper to my left of my station, and then I'll have a couple of pieces of newsprint down over here as well, so that as I'm printing I have somewhere to rest my squeegee and put my ink so that I'm not just getting ink all over the table surface. Okay. So I'm going to take one of these sheets and place it underneath the screen. And at first, just kind of eyeball the placement and try to get it centered. Again, I want to make sure that my registration marks are not getting cut off at the top, but also make sure that my paper is extending out past the bottom of my screen. So it looks pretty good. So it doesn't matter quite so much with this particular print because I'm going to be cutting it down. And I've got a pretty substantial amount of extra paper around it, but we'll measure it anyway just to try to get it centered. So I'll just slide this straight edge under here, and I'm just going to mark from the edge of my image to the edge of my paper. So that's sitting at about 2 1/4. So we'll see what it looks like on the other side. Might have to scoot it over just a little bit. And it's almost 2 1/4. That's pretty close. Slide over this way just a hair. Okay. I think that's pretty close there. If I was printing and I was getting really close to my paper edge, I'd be much more concerned about making sure this is really straight and really even. Like I said, since I'm going to be cutting a lot of this down anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time obsessing over that because it's not going to be a real big deal. So, all right, so it's centered. Registration marks are clear. They're not going to be cutting off. I've got room at the bottom. So now I can attach my pins. So we've got more of these registration pins right over here in this little plastic container. There's several of them in here. So just grab 3 of them and just carefully, by kind of holding down the paper as you do this, slide these underneath your paper and put the little post up through the holes in your paper. And then we're going to tape those down. So just make sure the tape's placed over those pins. Make sure the tape is secured down to the board good. Okay. All right, so we're pretty much set up there. So next thing we need to do is get our ink together. So we'll start mixing some ink next. If you find an ink that you like the color that's in there, you're welcome to use it. Feel free, go right ahead. Or if you want to use that, and that's pretty close to what you want, you just need to tint it or modify it a little bit, you could do that as well. If you need to mix a custom ink, so if you had to just kind of start from scratch, or if there's not enough quantity of the ink that you're interested in, just bring your own little containers. You can go to the dollar store. It doesn't have anything fancy, just like a Ziploc or Glad or whatever. Reusable plastic container is fine. So let's we'll add a little bit of some more yellow to this, and then add a bit of white to tint it. So you really only need to mix about, I would say, half to at most 3/4 full of one of these containers, so that we're not wasting too much ink, so that you're only really mixing enough for what you need and then some. We're only applying a really thin layer of ink at a time, so you're not using a ton of ink, unless you were printing a larger scale piece, or if you're just printing like huge flats, huge solid areas of color. You shouldn't be going through a ton of ink because of how thin that ink film is that you're actually applying to your paper. So, more yellow. Let's add a little bit of white to that. If you get to the bottom of a jar of ink, you can always use one of these flat spatulas to help get it out. Okay, looks better. Take it on just a little bit, and then just make sure if you get any spillover, just wipe the edge of your container so that when you try to put the lid back on it, it'll actually close and it won't dry out. And then we try to reuse these spoons, so you can set the spoon aside and rinse it off when you're done with it. Same thing with the spatula. Obviously, rinse the spatula out as well. So I typically, whenever I'm going to start printing, I'll go ahead and pre-mix all of my colors. So you can print out swatches. So before you start mixing your inks, go back into your Photoshop document, Illustrator, wherever it lives, and then just pull samples directly from all of your colors, print those out, and then usually I'll just print onto Love My 17 and have maybe a 3 or so inch round circle to use to help mix my colors. And then you can also just have it pulled up, on your phone, laptop, whatever, to try to match it that way as well. So the next thing we need to do is grab a squeegee. I also want to pull the drying rack close so it's close by, so I don't have to move around too much as I'm printing. So you want to get a squeegee that is a little bit larger than your image area. So one of these 13-inch ones should be just fine. We need to make sure it's able to hit your registration marks and obviously hit your entire image as well, so that'll be just fine. You want to make sure that you don't have a squeegee that's going to be too large. It's going to have difficulty going through the well, so it doesn't drag on the sides. Obviously not too small, so it's not going to cover your entire image. So just needs to extend beyond your image just a little bit. So we'll set that off to the side for right now. Go ahead and pour some ink into our screen. So I'm just going to pour this directly into the well and trying to pour it close to the top without it spilling over. But I'm just going to pour it right up here and just kind of run that bead of ink back and forth. All right. Okay. So again, I've got some paper down already. My extra paper is here close by, so as I print, I can just grab the next sheet, put it down, and just kind of feed it into the rack as I go. All right, so we're gonna lower this, pull that tape out. So I'll start with the squeegee at the top. I'm gonna pull out about, I would say, about 1/2 inch or so worth of ink. And if I poured that bead correctly, as I pull the ink towards me, it should be a pretty consistent bead. So it shouldn't be like really heavy here, like there. It should be pretty consistent all the way across. All right, so I'm gonna take the squeegee. I'm gonna pull it down toward me just a little bit. So you don't want to have too steep of an angle to where it's really close like that. You don't want it straight up or going back. So just pull it towards you to where it's at a comfortable angle. Again, not too far down like this. All right, so take that bead of ink, and so we're just gonna pull towards ourselves, a nice controlled motion, and just keep all the way down to the bottom. When you get down to the bottom of the frame, you can push and then lift the blade of the squeegee up so that you're pulling that ink up with you. Come back up to the top, just hit it down a couple of times. All right, so let's see what we got. So it looks pretty good. It's a little bit spotty on the right-hand side, so let's do one more pull, a little bit lighter pull this time. Just try to get nice coverage. I don't want to over-ink it. So again, just push the blade against the bottom of the frame, pull up, kind of hit it down. All right, get your squeegee out of the way, and we'll lift this up. All right, looks like we got pretty good coverage. From what I can tell, nothing is filled in, so that looks pretty good. Go and set this over here on the drawing rack. Pull the rack toward you, drop it down. All right, so in between, what I should be doing is flooding my screen. So to do that, just pulling the squeegee lightly to make sure that ink is staying in the screen so that my image doesn't get dried out as quickly. All right, so we'll feed the next piece in, put it onto our tabs, go ahead and pull off some more ink. Again, nice controlled motion, fairly firm pressure, bring it toward myself, all the way to the bottom, push down, lift up, and we'll follow up with a second, kind of lighter pass. So the number of passes you need to do is gonna vary depending on your image. If you have a big coverage area, you might have to do more than one. It also is gonna vary depending on the mesh of your screen. So I just wanna try to make sure that every time you're getting that same consistency, so you don't have, under-inked and over-inked areas. Trying to get as even of an ink application as you can. So flood it again in between, just really lightly. So you can, some people like to do what's called a push stroke whenever they flood. For whatever reason, that's just difficult for me to do. And basically what that means is instead of pulling right towards myself, after they print, they just essentially pull the squeegee this way and then push it back up. For whatever reason, that's just not easier for me to do. I've never had much success doing it that way, so I just always do it as a pull. That's just kind of personal preference, I guess. So if it's just like the registration marks, I wouldn't worry about doing the entire screen. That's just kind of time consuming. So if all it's doing is drawing the registration marks, for example, you can just do those areas. I could do the top in the same manner. So then after you scrub with the sponge, and you can start to see back through them again, then you can just take a paper towel, wipe it off. Just make sure that you're not leaving any moisture or dampness on there. Also, whenever you're scrubbing it, you're spreading a diluted film of ink on the screen, so to make sure that you're not leaving a bunch of thinned out ink on the screen. So that should have cleared it up. All right, so let's go ahead and put another piece down. Okay, that's good. So the same as with the registration marks that we just cleaned out. If you notice that you are losing some detail in your image, things are kind of filling in, again, it's an indication that your screen might be clogging. So you would do the same process with a sponge, just carefully scrubbing the entire front of the screen, and then again wiping the whole thing out with a paper towel. And then what I would do after that is, rather than going right back to your good paper, do at least a proof or two onto newsprint to make sure that the screen is opened back up. And if it's not, then you need to go ahead and try to clean it out again. If it's really bad, then you'll have to actually wash out your screen. But as long as you're keeping a good pace when you're printing, it shouldn't be as much of an issue. It is more of an issue when environmental factors like humidity are at play, or if you're using higher mesh screens. The higher the mesh of screen, more of a tendency it has to clog. So it does it typically less with lower mesh screens. So, but yeah, as long as you're going at a good pace and doing it quickly, you shouldn't have any issues with that. All right, so any leftover ink, we can put back into our mixed ink container. So just scrape this off back into our container, and then we'll go wash out the screen here in a second. So you would basically do your entire run of your first color. So do the entire run of that first color, and then you can go ahead and clean out your screen. And essentially you just follow that same process for each one of your layers. So after your printed layer, wash out your screen, and then you will do the entire run of the subsequent layers after you do that. So after I get this cleaned up, we'll go next door and we'll talk about how to clean out the screen and a few different options there. So now I'm just going and using the spatula to scrape off as much ink as I possibly can. For one, just to save it. Also, it's just going to make cleanup a lot easier if I'm not trying to, well, easier and less messy if I'm not trying to clean off huge gobs of ink. So I'm going to get off as much of that ink as I possibly can before we go over to the washout area. Pull all of your prints out of the rack, and again, just stack them close by. So I'm going to pull all these out of here, just have them in a stack right next to me like we did before. Okay, so since we already have all this set up, in theory, I should be able to just place my paper right on there. And then, again, in theory, these should line up without too much difficulty. So, let's hope that's the case. It's pretty close there. So rather than adjusting the screen too much, I want to try to keep my screen as secure as possible. So rather than kind of moving my screen so it's askew or pulling it out really far, I want to try to have my screen so it's as far back as it can possibly get in the hinge clamp, so that it's not going to move around. So the more contact it's making in the hinge clamp, the better. So rather than making my adjustments there, I'm just going to lift the tape from my registration pins, and I'll make my adjustments there. And then once I get it to where I need it to be, I'll go and tape them back down. So I'm just going to sort of shift this around to get it to where the marks that are visible from my previous layer are lining up the registration marks that I have on my screen here. And sometimes this can take a little fussing over to get right, but it's worth taking the time to do it, because registration, I mean, always is important, but with screen printing especially, it's the way that your image is actually built up. So if your registration isn't accurate, it's going to really affect the quality of your image. So it's definitely worth taking the time to do right. So one thing, once I've got it pretty close, I will actually, since now it's really small incremental changes, I loosened up my hinge clamps, so now I'm just barely kind of like tapping the screen to get it to fall into place, because at this point, it's like a 30/2 of an inch off, if that, right? It's a very small amount, really small discrepancy. So I'm just trying to fine tune it and dial it in. All right, so tighten these back down again. It helps sometimes too if you just kind of lightly push on the screen to make sure that it's making good contact, and that it's actually lining up properly. Okay, and then once it's in position, go ahead and tighten it all the way back down again. So once it looks like it's lined up as accurately as you can get it, go ahead and tape it back down again. Okay, so essentially the same as what we just did. Just pour our ink into the top. Just keep it close to the top of the screen, just a nice consistent bead back and forth. If you get a little off track with your bead, you can take a spatula and just kind of distribute that, even it out a little bit. So I got a little bit light in the middle, so we'll just kind of smooth this out with a spatula. Try to get it more even. All right. So just pull a little bit towards ourselves. Okay, so let's check it after one, see what it looks like. Let's do one more. I think also this was a pre-mixed ink. I think this is a transparent red, so we'll do 2 passes to try to get some better coverage. Okay, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty tight. I don't see any gaps, so that lined up pretty good. All right. So flooding in between. So let's stop at one on this one just to see what the difference is. So that time I just stopped on one, and I can see some more of that really kind of small texture. So let's maybe just see if we can keep going with one, so I'm not losing any texture. Just try to do one pass, fairly firm pressure. So also just keep an eye out to see if there's any shift that's happening. The registration marks start getting a little bit off. They need to make some accommodations there, which can be kind of tricky, especially if it's going to require you to actually move your paper any, because what's likely to happen is that your screen is going to dry out. So if you start getting really off, it's probably going to require you to go ahead and wipe down the entire screen in the front, dry it off with the paper towel really good, let it sit for just a second, and then kind of make your adjustments and realign it. All right, so same as before, just scrape off any leftover ink. Okay, so we'll go wash this one out, and so since we're done with this, I'll just go ahead and walk you guys through completely cleaning your screens out.